I'm currently fiscally planning my strategy out for next year. I found this great opportunity. This guy, he wants me to play this tile game. I think I'm going to choose the red tile. What can go wrong with this? Let's get to it. Welcome! Another episode of IBF On Demand. I'm your strategic, passionate, and sometimes humorous host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thank you for following, subscribing. Follow me on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much for completing another year. Now we're over 2 years, 4 seasons in, and you're continuing to watch. So thank you. So as far as happy Festivus, I don't have many grievances right now because I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and I got a great audience out there that's supporting this. So thank you very much. We do have a sponsor still as well, Arkiva. They have a new look, same quality service and product for your one-plan S&OP software solution. Check out Arkiva. A lot's been going on right now. Has a few podcasts talking about supply chain problems, talking about inventory, talking about a lot COVID. We've talked about a lot of what's going on. What's hitting the headlines we've actually been talking about in these podcasts. Well, we're going to give you a preview because you haven't seen these headlines yet, but they're coming. The perfect storm is brewing. Listen to me. Inflation, we've seen constant inflation, 6% or more. Of consumer inflation. Guess what? Businesses, they're seeing 10, 12, 15% inflation. They're seeing those. That will be passed on. Inflation is not transitory. It will continue through most of 2022. You will see an interest rate increase. Guess what that means? Less borrowing power for businesses. More cash they need to be able to create. They're passing this on to you as well. You will see this continue to be passed through to the consumer. You will start seeing inventory imbalances. What's happened with the port issues, what happened with panic buying, what happened with a crazy Christmas season that we had means inventory mix issues companies are going to see. We're going to have an imbalance of inventory. They're going to have too much of what they don't need, not enough of what they need. Difficulties getting what they need. You're going to see the secondary markets being flooded with excess inventory, causing pricing increases. Margins are going to be impacted. As inflation, we're trying to raise our prices. We're going to see the same time the need for cash and trying to bring more money into businesses. You're going to start hearing words in 2022 like covenants, cash, margin. Those are going to be the words you're going to hear in 2022. Besides agile, you're really going to start talking reactive, covenants, cash, margin. That's the terms you're going to start hearing a lot more of coming in the year to come. So what's that mean? Those need to be brought into an S&OP IBP process. That's where you can start talking about those now. You can start solving for those now in a good S&OP IBP process. But to do that, you have to have finance involved. So we're going to talk today a little bit about bringing finance involved. And like always, I got a very, very special guest to help talk about this today. Debbie Clymer is the Global Enterprise IBP at Cummins, Inc. She's a strong operations professional with a master's in business administration, focused in finance from Ball State University. It's where she may have got a lot of her experience, though, or ability to take care of business was as a petty officer third class in the U.S. Navy. She is a prolific writer and speaker as well. She actually has her own IBP blog. Check that out. Our paths crossed in Orlando recently at a conference. She gave a fantastic presentation on IBP, finance, and strategy. I wanted to continue that conversation today. Let me bring in Debbie. So welcome, Debbie. I'm excited to have you actually on this podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Yep. Did a fantastic job in Orlando, by the way. I got lots of great feedback afterwards. People are still talking about your presentation in Orlando. So I wanted to continue that conversation on this podcast. I'm excited to actually have that conversation here.
Well, I can talk about IBP all day long. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've got every kind of failure mode you could possibly think of, and how to make it work, and how to make it practical and work for the organization, and so yeah, I definitely have a lot of passion for it.
Okay, so we can actually talk all day. Unfortunately, it's going to be like edited down to about 20, 25 minutes, but we can have this conversation all day long because I
Yeah.
enjoy talking about this as well. So we get talking, who knows how long it's going to take us. So
Okay.
when you were in that conversation in Orlando, you talked a lot about financiers' role in IBP process. And that's what I really wanted to talk about here was really finances role because I think in the year to come, they're going to play a lot bigger role, or at least need to. And I wanted to get your kind of take on how to bring them in and the importance of having them there. So let's talk about the importance of having finance involved in an IBP process first.
Yeah, well, I think that the important thing to think about is that IBP is a business process. It's how you manage the business and what business decisions that you need to make. And most businesses are run from a financial plan or a financial forecast or a P&L or a profit and loss statement or a pro forma statement or and balance sheets. Those are the language of finance. And so how does the IBP process from a bottom up um, look at the plans that are going forward that can be financialized, and so that the business has the ability to make the right decisions at the right time on the monthly cadence. A lot of times in the IVP process, we focus on supply chain. There's definitely a supply chain focus. Like the purpose of a demand plan is so that we can help supply chain, right? And yeah, there is that element of it. That's true. But we also want to craft a financial forecast so that the business can say, hey, are we meeting our revenue targets? Do we have enough in our plan? And we can't do that unless we financialize it and trust the information to come up through the process. And so if you have a lot of bias in your demand plan, or we don't trust our supply chain's ability to deliver, then our ability to make decisions financially and what decisions we need to make from a finance perspective over the longer horizon becomes really compromised. And so IBP, you have to think about the finance requirements of an IBP process, not just supply chain.
Let me ask you, you talk about a lot of companies, I hear they run the business off of shareholder value, EBITDA, P&Ls, balance sheets, but then they get into a S&OP and they're talking forecast there and capacity. I mean, those things are important, but I think we really need to link to what's running the business is what I'm hearing.
Yes, and we IBP is a process or a mechanism to get you to your strategic objectives. It's supposed to help you align there and making sure that the business is structured in a way to make the decisions to keep you on that trajectory. Now, if you don't financialize it or you don't trust the information to be financialized, which is one of the things I hear quite frequently, is that hey, finance can do this at a top level. We don't need a bottom up plan. We don't need to trust the what's coming up from the, because they're all wrong anyway. So why would we bother with that? And the fallacy is that, we need to be dependable in our plans and what we're aligning to, and having, finance be part of that allows the business to have a credible plan and make the necessary decisions, make the necessary investments, make the necessary plans in order to keep the business on that strategic growth initiatives that they've established for themselves.
Okay, you mentioned this because a lot of finance, my background is it's a top-down type of approach sometimes using ratios is really what they're trying to develop their financial long-term financial plans from. You mentioned a bottoms-up approach really in an S&OP IBP type of process. What happens if finance doesn't trust that plan that you're presenting? How do you manage that?
Well, here's what happens. So if finance doesn't trust the process, so as you have an S&OP or an IBP process, you starts with, you get your demand plan, right? You say this is what we believe our demand forecast is going to be over a 2-year horizon or a 3-year horizon or whatever your longer term view is. And so you get that demand plan. You can calculate revenue associated in that. That's essentially bottom up there. Now, supply chain then has to say, okay, can I deliver to it? Can I deliver to it? So if the demand plan says, I'm gonna make up numbers. If the demand plan says, hey, I can sell 1,000 widgets, and supply says, well, I can only build 800, then what is finance going to financialize in there? And then if you're looking at what is going to get financialized into the forecast, what we would like to see is that if you're constraining your demand, we would want to take what supply is saying, because that is then going to be a realistic plan in terms of what is the long-term view look like in order to make the decision, because you're making the evaluation in the MBR in terms of, hey, I want to grow my business to be whatever the target is. I want to be $1 billion business in 3 years. If you don't trust that information, you need to know whether or not you're on that trajectory or not. And so having that right bottom up truth as we know it coming from IBP or your S&OP process, then what happens is that your finance, if you don't trust it, finance will just do a top level plan, which may or may not be realistic, or may have some bias in itself associated with it, or not connected to the execution part of the process, which then creates a problem. And so then what happens is, in what I've seen, is businesses tend to be less responsive on the monthly cadence. So you'll see, we're going to review where we are on the longer term plan on an annual basis as opposed to monthly, because you don't really want to have those kind of conversations, and oftentimes by that time it's too late, right? You course correct, annually is nearly impossible, right? So you got to be able to respond and be effective in that response. So the bottom up plan really enables you to look at the reality of your situation, the reality of where your business is from the current state, and then evaluate that, financialize that, and say, here's where we're going, and being able to have that analysis. In its absence, you're making guesstimates. And when you're making guesstimates, you postpone decisions. You just don't make those decisions until you feel like you have all of the data and information available. And that, slows and delays your response to correct over the longer horizon in your strategy. That's what
Okay.
I've seen. And so it's really important that the businesses focus on that bottom up process.
Okay. So, with that, is there any? I mean, it's great having finance and everybody working together, but we understand you've been there. It's not always our reality. Coming into a new organization or building, you built a fantastic IBP process there at Cummins, but you built it over time. How did you get the finance as far as engaged? How do you get that trust so they are using your plans? You talked about the why we should, but what are some tricks, Lori, to start them? The baby steps into trusting the process and getting them at the table every month, and what's some secrets?
Well, pure tenacity.
You got that. I'll give you that one.
Pure tenacity. I think that, in the early days of implementation, it's getting you got a lot of fixing of the bottom up process, so you got to get credibility. You have to start with the credibility. And so, it's not an overnight thing. You can't say, okay, I'm going to start an IBP process or an S&OP process, and then within 3 months I want it fully working and operational. It just doesn't work that way practically. And so what happens is that fixing the issues, that the credibility issues, fixing your bias issues, fixing your supply chain issues, fixing your alignment between what demand is doing and what supply chain is doing, and fixing all those things takes time, and that's all building the credibility. Now, I'd say in my experience, how I got finance involved, it took me a couple of years, at least a full year of IBP deployment before the finance controller said, yeah, I think this is going to be a good thing. I think I need to chair this review, and drive that. And it was the first ability to be able to show that 3-year view. When you start looking at that 3-year P&L, and you start having that conversation and says, hey, when we look at our P&L over the 3-year horizon with what the actual real bottom up plan is, our EBITDA numbers in years 2 and 3 are not looking good. So what decisions do we need to make in the current year that's going to help us out next year and the year after that? What it enabled the finance controller to see is have visibility to costs that they wouldn't ordinarily see. And so what happens in traditional finance is that they'll take the revenue and they'll take the guesstimate, and maybe they modify the revenue a bit, but they'll take the revenue, right? And then when they craft that P&L statement, what they'll do is they'll use percentages to just push that P&L together, and then they'll say, okay, here it is. What that does is it artificially hides the real the costs that you're not seeing, so the reality of the situation. And so if you look at what your product plan portfolio is trying to accomplish over that 3 years and what costs they're projecting, if you looked at what those costs are relative to what the percentages are on that P&L, they're not the same. And so when we started bringing the real information, it was the controller that say, man, I think his words were, I never had visibility to these types of things before. When we just push a percentage-based P&L to make it look the way we want it to look. We never seen these costs before. We're projecting a cost based on assumptions. So like a good one today that we'll probably see a lot is it's no secret logistics costs are probably going up, right? And so what does that impact on you from a PBIT perspective or your EBITDA next year and the year after that? And does the business have the appetite to say that, okay, in next year and the year after that, 2022 and 2023, our EBITDA isn't going to be at 15%. We're looking, at 12, or we're looking at 10 because our costs are going up. Is that okay? Are we comfortable with that, or do we need to do something different? At what point do you make business decisions that are going to offset, and how much of margins are you going to lose? And you can't do that if your IBP process isn't bringing those projected costs into the picture. If we just use a percentage based on that P&L, we're going to miss those types of things. Or what we'll see is that they'll do an ad hoc kind of analysis. It won't be part of the regular forecast and drive that kind of discussion. And so that's where I think that how finance really got involved was being able to really clearly show, hey, costs over the longer horizon that we are projecting, real costs, bottom up, truth as we know it, as we like to say, and then comparing that into what does EBITDA look like in those different scenarios. The visibility that finance is able to see was the catalyst to say, yeah, I need to be heavily involved in IBP, and that's what was the driver for me.
Yeah, some great points there, and I like you stressed, because a lot of times we just see those ratios being used as we're going to hold margin, we're going to hold our whatever we saw as cost in 2021, and that bringing all the costs, bringing in cash flow projections. I think that's really key, and I think that's a great point what you had. You talked about the 3-year plans, and that's great. I get a lot of feedback and a lot of questions saying their S&OP IBP process is stuck in the next 3 weeks or next 3 months at best. How can we focus? How can we get the company to really start focusing outside of those 3 months? Because that's where you're going to need really finance involved, is we're talking outside of those constraints. How do we get our IBP process to really just stop being reactive and start being more strategic, more fiscally engaged beyond those 3 months? That's the big question I get. Forget the 3 years. Yeah. How do we get past 3 months?
Yeah, I get that all the time. And I think that, where your focus is on, typically those businesses that are running an IBP process and they're stuck, there's a couple of things. If they're stuck in the 3-month horizon, which I've seen, my guess would be is that it's very supply chain driven. If it's a supply chain driven IBP process, they typically are really hyper focused in that 3 month horizon. The business side, not so much, but the business is a little bit better about that. And it comes down to where you're holding the process accountable, the IBP process accountability for it. One of the things is to getting over the 3 year. We struggled with this too. It was AOP, 1 year horizon. The main thing about the main thing is that it's the main thing, and the main thing is AOP, right? And so, just make sure you hit your AOP, which made it really challenging to get to the 3 year horizon. So, and I spent, a year or so, hey, we got to talk about years 2 and 3. I mean, the whole notion of, we want to make sure that the decisions that we're making in the short term aren't going to negatively impact us over the longer horizon. And bringing that forward, one is, does the business actually accountable for a 3 year horizon? And so a lot of times it sounds really nice, but and they'll say, yes, we are accountable, the business is accountable for the 3 year horizon, but not really. And so one of the things that we found was that in working in IBP is that AOP was definitely the fixture of where people felt real pain that if they didn't hit that AOP target, there was going to be problems, right?
Yeah.
But the 3 year horizon, we didn't have the same emphasis, right? There's no, it was kind of like, oh, well, Debbie, don't worry so much about that 3 year horizon because, we're gonna change that next year in the next strategic strat plan, that we do once a year. We'll fix that, and all that gap you keep talking about is just miraculously going to go away, which it does, and so then it becomes not a real dynamic. And so in order to really get the organization through the 3 year knot hole, or the 4 year, or the 2 year, whatever that length is that the leadership of that organization has to feel ownership of the process and accountable for achieving the objective at the end of that 3 year, in the same way that they feel that clear connection to AOP. That's a big problem. The other part of the problem is that typically supply chain are the sponsors of IBP, and they like it in the 3 month zone. They really like it there, and so they really want to keep it there and drive the more execution part of the processes, and focus on the change in that short term alignment, because that's what they are. The other issue that you might find in the inability is who are the people that are involved in it. If you're talking about a smaller organization, maybe in a $1 billion size, then it's probably the same people and it probably works better. If you're in a large corporation, like the size of Cummins or a 3M, or one of these other big companies, right? You got layers and layers and layers of really senior people in the organization. And so trying to figure out who is actually accountable for growing the business may not necessarily be the same people running your IBP process. And so you got tactical people and you got strategy people who are outgrowing the business. In large organizations, those are sometimes different people. And so if you think of who owns gap closing, who owns the consequences of the plans? So who says, all right, so what? If I look at my IBP business, or the process of IBP, if I look at the information coming from IBP, who says, so what do we need to do about it? And it seems as though a lot of times organizations are structured in the people who are the reactors, not the what are we going to do about it. And that can be a real problem in the organization. And so depending on the business, those are the types of things that I see that prevent people from getting that 30-year view, or being able to focus. Now, I will say that when you fix some of those issues, it's night and day. It is night and day. I mean, I've
That it
seen the
is.
business. I have seen supply chain go from, because of this very thing that I'm talking about, where I've seen supply review focus just on 3 months, start talking about, capacity planning for 2025, in a relatively short period of time. If you put those types of focus in, so that if you have really strong growth initiatives and you really want to grow the business in whatever your strategy is, and you're holding people accountable to that, then supply chain has to come to the table and say, all right, here's what it's going to take for me to deliver that, and start looking at capacity planning over the longer period. And it, when you make that transition, it's a huge step change in the IBP process.
Yeah. And you mentioned AOP. For some people out there, you're looking at annual operating plan is what you're talking about there. And
Yes.
when we're talking finance, just my own experience one time to say it's not always supply chain. So a pitfall to watch out for, audience, is I had seen a company finance very heavily involved in the S&OP process, but at the same time, they then converted the S&OP to what's going to happen this quarter. How are we going to end the quarter? Because if we're going to meet the street estimates. So they're the ones that hijacked the S&OP IBP process to what's going to happen at the end of this quarter, and became very, very, focused on the next 2 or 3 months. So be careful as a pitfall there. Make sure that that's not driving to, because you mentioned it's what really drives the pain point for the organization. So we need to get to those strategic horizons. So, well, it was a pleasure, and we could talk all day, but unfortunately, I think we're a little bit out of time. I know I'm going to see you at the University of Kentucky Supply Chain Forum coming up here. I think it's in February that we're going to be getting together then. So I'll actually see you in person there at the University of Kentucky.
I know. I'm looking forward to it.
I know it. And then hopefully I'm going to see you at an IBF conference in 2022 as well. This COVID thing will be behind us and we can start getting back. We got a whole, a schedule of events coming up in person in 2022. And I'm going to see you at one of them, or at least one of them.
I hope so. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing with our audience. And it was great seeing you here on our podcast. And I'll see you again soon.
All right. Thanks.
It was a great interview. I knew it would be with Debbie. She has great things to add. I wish we could have talked longer. I said we probably talked all day, but we only have 30 minutes for you, and we're almost up with our time already. Real quick in the takeaways, I do want to say there is a difference between what we're talking about with a forecast and a budget. We talked a lot about them really being the same. There is a difference. And the difference is that a forecast should really drive the budget. We do not want the budget to drive the forecast. There is a distinct difference there. And too many times I see companies that force the forecast to become the budget. That's not what we were talking about here. What we're talking about here is a true, strong S&OP IBP process, really driven by demand planning, driven by forecast, that really builds a strong, independent, unconstrained, unbiased forecast that drives your S&OP process, that drives a budget 2-3 years out down there. We're talking about that one number attitude, but starting with demand plan. The last things I want to mention then is really some key things, some takeaways that I have. Need to incorporate changes as they occur. One of the things she mentioned was as changes occur to not only the demand, cost, outlooks, as markets change, you need to incorporate that into your long-term rolling types of budget. What's happening 2 years down the road. So as changes occur, you need to be able to bring those in. You need to understand the drivers. We talked about ratios is a lot of times top down. More than those ratios, we need to understand what are the true drivers, sensitivity of some of those drivers, and bringing that into your budgeting, rolling budgets, your financial projections. Understand the drivers, the sensitivities of them, not just the top-down type of ratios, but what the true drivers are. We want early visibility and to a long-term type of P&L, long-term types of balance sheets. Not just an inventory projection, not just my, what I can do as far as capacity. So here's my constrained view going forward. Now we want long-term visibility into a long-term P&L, long-term balance sheets to be able to make decisions that are really impactful to the business out 2 years or out past constraints that currently happen. And the last thing I'm going to really focus on then is that transparency, visibility, communication, collaboration, all the tenets of a strong S&OP IBP process that I talked about. I had a whole podcast talking about, these as well. The transparency, that visibility, being open and honest conversations, laying out exactly what we know, what we don't know, having those communications cross-sectionally, the collaboration, all those things really feed in to a strong, coordinated business process to make decisions with, a strong S&OP, IBP type of process. Well, since this is the end of another episode, I got this game to play with these tiles we got to hit on the floor. It's going to be a fun game. He promised me quite a bit of money. I don't have to give him any back if he loses. I think this is going to be a win-win situation for me. Well, go ahead and send stars if you like, cash, like, subscribe, whatever you do. My name is Eric Wilson. This is IBF On Demand. Find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. We have our Kiva, new look, same sponsor, S&OP Software Solution. Check them out. This is IBF. We are at the end of year 2. I want to thank you. Said happy Festivus, happy whatever holiday you have. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for your support of this. Thank you for being part of IBF. We have a whole 2022 season coming. Check that out now. Go to ibf.org. Check out all the conferences coming up. We got conferences in Scottsdale. We're going to be in Chicago. We're going to be back in Orlando. We're going to be in Amsterdam next year. We have a whole season of conferences, of boot camps, of best practices, of S&OP conferences. Something that's going to fit your specific needs. We're going to have it available. We're going to throw a few town halls and virtual events in there as well because you tend to like them still. So we're going to provide them for you. We got a whole season. Check them out, ibf.org. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for supporting them. And with that, I got one more great kids game I want to mention. Wash your hands.